Listen to me, there is something going on in Crater Lake National Park. I've been hearing rumors about this for years. All across the park, people are disappearing and then turning up dead, and this is not a new phenomenon. They won't admit it, but this is something that's been going on for literal decades, and I've got the receipts. I'm talking about things like, for example, how in October of 2006, a father and son accidentally ended up playing one of the deadliest games of hide and seek of all time. And so allow me to introduce you to an 8-year-old boy named Samuel Bolke. Now, Samuel was visiting Crater Lake National Park with his father, Ken. They lived in Portland, Oregon, and Samuel was known as this energetic kid. From everything that I've read, Samuel apparently had a mild form of autism, which would sometimes make him sensitive to loud noises and bright lights, things like that. And Samuel also really loved to play hide and seek, and he was actually really good at it too. One time he hid so well that his parents actually had to call the police and the firefighters to come search for him, and he only came out from his hiding spot when someone eventually called out, "You win," which those are some pretty legendary hide and seek skills, and that means a lot coming from me because I was pretty much the king of the playground back in the day. I mean, you name it, I was the best at it. But I mean, clearly Samuel was on an entirely different level when it came to playground games. However, my mom always told me that it's all fun and games until someone gets hurt. And well, Samuel and his father were about to find this out the hard way. Around 4 p.m. on October 14th, 2006, Samuel and his father stopped on the side of the road while driving through Crater Lake's scenic rim drive. They had pulled over about 500 yards from the Cleetwood Cove parking area, and when they stepped out of the car, they were standing near a steep slope that overlooked the forest and, of course, the beautiful lake below them. The sunlight was starting to fade, the air was turning colder, and they were on their way back to their cabin near Diamond Lake. But first, of course, it was time to play. In my research, I couldn't figure out the exact game Samuel and his dad were playing. I mean, maybe it was tag or hide and seek, but what I do know for sure is that the two of them were running around, chasing each other around a little bit, and just having themselves a fun little father-son moment out in one of the most beautiful places on earth. But sometimes majestic beauty can come with a very heavy price. And by the way, if you appreciate my efforts to keep these stories alive, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm so close to hitting 1 million subscribers, trying to do it this year. And so if you're a new viewer, I'm gonna do my absolute best to earn your sub by the end of this video. And if you're a repeat viewer, please hit subscribe right now and join the movement. In the middle of their game, Samuel jogged up a hill that was just above him, and his father Ken watched as his son crested the hill and then disappeared just out of sight. As far as Ken was concerned, Samuel was just playing around, just like he always did. Ken was so not worried about the situation that he didn't even immediately chase after Samuel. He was sure that his little head would pop out from the other side of the hill any minute now, right? And so Ken waited for another moment, but Samuel hadn't come back out yet, and so Ken began calling his son's name, but he didn't get any response. He called again, and still nothing. Ken even turned back to the car for a moment, calling out that he was gonna leave and expecting his son to come running after him, right? But that didn't happen either. And so Ken started to get a pit in his stomach. Playtime was obviously over. Ken ran up the hill, calling out Samuel's name over and over. By the time that he turned a corner, he actually saw his son roughly 50 feet ahead of him. Samuel was in the middle of climbing another hill, heading into the nearby woods. And so Ken chased after him and told his son to stop running. But whenever Ken got close, it felt like Samuel was just out of reach, almost as if it was all still part of the game. Samuel ran over the crest of another hill with his father right behind him. But this time, when Ken reached the top, all he saw was wilderness. His son was now nowhere to be found. The terrain beyond the ridge that they had been playing on sloped down into a forest area, but it certainly didn't seem like it could instantly hide someone in just a matter of a few seconds, especially not a child wearing bright colors like Samuel. He was wearing this bright blue coat. There were no immediate cliffs in the area, no sudden drops, and basically no obvious explanation for how Samuel could have vanished so completely in that short amount of time. But regardless of all those facts, Ken just could not find his son anywhere, and so he was forced to do the hardest thing any parent can ever have to do. He reported Samuel missing. The search began almost immediately. Within hours, the area around Cleetwood Cove filled with over 200 searchers that were combing through roughly 6 square miles of forest and slope terrain. And to make matters even worse, a snowstorm hit Crater Lake in the days immediately following Samuel's disappearance, and according to the sheriff's office, the weather was seriously hampering their initial search efforts. Specialized rescue teams came in from across Oregon as well as neighboring states, including canine units chasing Samuel's scent through the trees, helicopters scanning from above, and heat-sensing cameras sweeping the ground below for any sign of this young, fun-loving boy. And as all of this was going on, of course, the theories began to roll in. Knowing Samuel's past, some authorities wondered if he was out there still just playing. Maybe he was in the woods somewhere, hiding in the most extreme way that we know he was capable of. Maybe he had even dug himself into some kind of small space like a tree stump or a hole in order to hide even better. After all, we know that he would do basically anything to win games like this. During the search itself, Samuel's father, Ken, also told the media that he and the FBI believed his son thought running into the woods was just a game. Right? Another theory was that maybe Samuel had gotten distracted while looking for gold. And what I mean by that is that Ken also talked to the press about his son's obsession with finding little yellow pumice stones on the ground that he referred to as gold, not actual gold. And so one theory that kept popping up was that Samuel might have noticed a patch of yellow rocks on the slope above him and became hyper-focused on chasing down as many of the shiny stones as he possibly could. And maybe by the time he looked up from his mini gold rush, well, he might have found himself completely isolated and separated from his dad, as well as any other kind of help. From everything that I could find, this theory mostly hinges on his dad's speculation and not from any other hard facts. And so I can't say either way if tiny yellow rocks are actually the thing to blame in this mystery. It's just a theory. And of course, naturally, we have to wonder if wildlife had anything to do with Samuel's disappearance. Crater Lake National Park can be home to species like black bears, coyotes, even mountain lions. And so there is a chance that young Samuel could have been a victim of some kind of attack from a predator like that, especially a mountain lion. From my understanding, they don't attack very often, but when they do, they tend to favor children because they're just smaller. However, in all of their searching, the authorities never found any evidence of an animal attack, no tracks or torn clothing or any sign of remains that would lead them to believe that there was an animal involved. Now, I also read an article that stated officials ruled out foul play of any kind in this case, and that initially made a lot of sense to me. After all, Ken literally watched his son run away from him, but he didn't see anyone scoop him up or kidnap him or something like that. But then I wondered how authorities could be so certain that Samuel didn't encounter anyone suspicious after he had disappeared. He had disappeared. How they don't know what happened to him. And this is when I finally began to ask myself a really big question that I'm honestly a little afraid to ask. And so this question is, can we fully trust the original story from Ken in the first place? And look, I want to be really careful here because all available evidence has shown that Ken was a loving, caring father who has helped immensely in the search for his son. But with that said, we don't have any other answers, and I'm sure there were times where authorities wondered about him as well, just like I'm doing right now. I'm honestly a little bit confused by the fact that Ken somehow couldn't run faster than his 8-year-old. Now, I don't have kids, so maybe that's entirely normal. I don't know, but I was also confused as to why he stopped the car to play hide and seek or tag in the woods when it was also starting to get dark at that time of day. And we also know that it was cold enough for Samuel to be in a winter coat and that a literal snowstorm was going to be rolling in soon. And so maybe that's just me being skeptical based on my experience reading disturbing mysteries like this all the time. I can definitely admit that I've become a little bit jaded from these kinds of things. Ultimately, I really do want to believe that Ken was just a dad trying to have fun with his son, and he just got hit with an insane tragedy in the process. And of course, I need to make it very clear that the authorities never arrested or charged Ken in connection with Samuel's disappearance at all. So from everything I can tell, I don't think Ken was involved, but in researching this story, I did see a number of people that were a little bit skeptical of him, and so I figured that was probably going to come up in the comments of this video, and so I should at least address it. After a full snowy week of theorizing and searching desperately for Samuel, crews still hadn't found anything at all. No footprints, no abandoned clothing, and no definitive signs that Samuel had either fallen or wandered away or was hidden away somewhere. By the end of that week, the search for Samuel was officially called off. There were still some smaller searches as time went on, but eventually even more snow came as fall slowly morphed into winter, and suddenly Crater Lake and any possible clues behind Samuel's disappearance would soon be buried under feet of snow. And so to this day, Samuel is still very much considered missing. And so, man, this one is just so sad. I mean, one minute he was having the time of his life playing with his father, and then the next, he basically vanished into thin air. Samuel's case is terrifying because a child just disappeared in plain sight. However, adults aren't that much safer in Crater Lake either, and I'm gonna prove it to you with this next story. But the truth is that it wouldn't even be possible for me to tell these often forgotten stories without the help of Drink Element, who is the longest running supporter of my channel, and it's not even close. Element is the sponsor of this video, and these days the thing that I've been reaching for the most is actually their Element Sparkling, because sometimes I want, some electrolytes, but I also want something that feels more like a casual beverage rather than like a sports drink. Sometimes I just want to hear a can crack open and know that I made at least one good decision that day. And so that is exactly where sparkling fits in for me. It's cold, it's fizzy, it's ridiculously refreshing, especially lemonade salts, and it has zero sugar and other junk. Now, don't get me wrong, Element's packets are still what I think of for big efforts, for long hikes, and for the times where I really need to be deliberate about my electrolytes. But sparkling is more for normal life, right? Like the drives to the trailhead, editing for 6 hours straight, or when I'm just trying to stay on top of hydration without making it feel like homework. It's built for those in-between moments, and honestly, that's probably why I've been drinking it so much. Each slim 12-ounce can has 500 milligrams of sodium, 100 milligrams of potassium, and 30 milligrams of magnesium, so it actually gives you a meaningful dose of electrolytes in a format that feels way easier to kind of just grab and enjoy. And so if you want to try it, go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link at the top of the description. And when you buy through my link, you're going to get a sample pack of 8 additional Element sticks thrown in with your order for no extra cost, which is a really good deal, and it's a great way to try some of Element's most popular flavors. And so one more time, that's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link at the top of the description. And now let's get back to this next insane story. Glenn Allen Mackey was a 33-year-old mechanical engineer from Brea, California, and he had been traveling alone and was driving north towards Crater Lake National Park in October of 1991. Apparently, he was on a solo tour of national parks across the West. Now, Glenn was 6'1", 165 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes, and according to reports that I saw, his family was somewhere back east, and he didn't really have any known relatives in the Brea area. I don't know. He simply seemed to be a relatively young man on a weeks-long adventure. On October 14th, Glenn entered Crater Lake National Park and received a receipt from the ranger. He pulled into the Rim Village parking lot on the south side of Crater Lake, very close to the Crater Lake Lodge. But from everything that I could find in my research, he didn't check into the lodge itself. In fact, there are a lot of things that he didn't do once he got to the Rim Village. He didn't sign his name into any of the trail logbooks. He didn't use a payphone to call any of his relatives back east to give them an update on what he was doing. And as far as anyone can tell, he didn't have any meaningful interactions with any strangers. At least, not with anyone who was willing to admit it anyways. In fact, we know so many things that Glenn didn't do from this point in the story, but we have zero idea of what he actually did do, because this is where Glenn's trail went cold, and for that matter, so did Crater Lake National Park. On October 16th, a massive storm hit the park and buried it in sheets and sheets of deep snow. The Rim Village parking lot sits at roughly 7,100 feet in elevation, and so it was hit extra hard by this winter storm. And when snowplow crews arrived to clear the lot, they noticed that every car that had been parked there had been already claimed and moved, except for one of them. When park officials took a closer look at this car, that's when they started to realize that something truly terrible must have happened. Inside the car, they found keys, a passport, cash, toiletries, and a driver's license with the name Glenn Mackey. They also found the park entrance receipt from October 14th, which hinted that the car might have been sitting there alone for most of that week, and that Glenn might have been lost out in the snowy wilderness for that entire time as well. And so with this discovery, the search for Glenn Mackey was on. The snowstorm had been covering trails and footprints for days by this point, and so authorities were already starting from a major disadvantage. But each day, the crews grew larger and the urgency to find Glenn kept mounting. By Saturday, 3 different canine search teams and nearly 40 people were out in the park battling through waist-deep snow and scouring the frozen landscape. However, each day brought the same grim reality, that the search had turned up absolutely nothing. There were no tracks, no additional clues, and no hint of where Glenn might have gone. And so the authorities and the searchers were forced to consider every possible theory. The first thing they had to consider was that Glenn might have been hit by that massive snowstorm. I mean, that makes sense, right? Authorities didn't know the exact moment when he disappeared, and their best guess was that he was missing since at least last Wednesday, which was the day before they started the official search. But I mean, that's the only thing they kind of knew for sure. They didn't know if Glenn had parked his car in the Rim Village parking lot when the weather was perfectly fine, only to get caught out in the heart of the blizzard later, or if the storm was already in full force by the time he chose to set out into the wilderness. And if he was caught out in the storm, officials were not very confident that he would have been prepared for this weather at all. Which brings me to another interesting layer to this story that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I read in an article that authorities said, quote, Glenn's car contained items that a person would not leave behind if he were going to make an extended side tour from the national park. And here's my question. What exactly is an extended side tour from the national park? Did they mean that they didn't think he was gearing up for like a backpacking trip or a long thru hike? And if that's the case, why didn't they just say that? And what did they expect to find if he was on a backpacking trip? Like maps or food, a backpack? Like, wouldn't he have just taken all that stuff with him? It feels important to point out this phrasing, and it makes me more confused every single time that I read it. I also have to wonder if there was even a small possibility that Glenn had actually disappeared on purpose. Now, in all of the articles I've read about this story, they constantly point out that Glenn had, quote, no known relatives in Brea or nearby. And we also know that he had been on an extended solo trip through multiple parks. And so, was he feeling isolated and just wanted to go completely off the grid? I do know that rangers had information and they were gonna reach out to his relatives back east, but that's pretty much the extent of everything I could find about any family or friends involved in the search process. And for what it's worth, the police never found any notes or any real indication that Glenn was trying to harm himself or anything like that, but that just left them with even more questions than they already had. 5 days would pass with the authorities failing to find any additional leads. The snow continued to pile up over Crater Lake National Park, and with each snowflake, it felt like the hope of finding Glenn was slowly being buried. On Monday, October 24th, the official search effort was scaled back. The park's chief ranger, George Buckingham, explained that the snow, which was 5 feet deep in some areas, was basically erasing any possible traces or tracks for them to follow. Their canine teams were working tirelessly, but even the dog's strong noses couldn't do much in this kind of weather. Buckingham said, quote, we'll still continue our investigation, but we're just not putting people outside in a continued field search. And so with that decision, the search for Glenn came to a crawl and his trail went cold. That is, until years later, when a firefighter made a shocking discovery in a very remote area of the park that could have changed this case forever. In September of 2006, a park firefighter was in a remote area known as Bybee Creek when he stumbled upon something that made him stop in his tracks. The heat of the summer was starting to die down, and you could feel the cool breeze of fall and winter weather in the air. And as this firefighter walked through the woods, he noticed something on the ground that looked like it was just out of place. As he got closer and closer, he realized that he hadn't discovered an animal or trash or anything else he assumed he might find out there on a normal day. Nope. As he stood right above his discovery and then bent down for a clear view, he understood that his day was suddenly very far from normal because he had found human skeletal remains. He reported this chilling discovery to park officials immediately, but they actually resisted the urge to tell the public. I mean, if these remains were connected to a crime, for instance, they would want to complete a full investigation before making a statement and before they had a chance to do any real investigative work. And another thing too, before they even had a chance to do any real investigating in the Bybee Creek area, the winter weather hit Crater Lake like a freight train. Snow once again prevented anyone from reaching the site of the remains until the following summer in 2007. And so it was then that park rangers finally arrived alongside FBI agents, and when they did, the bones were weathered, scattered, and honestly held very few actionable clues for them to work with. Park Ranger Dave Brennan said, quote, "From the condition of the remains, it was evident they had been there for some number of years." Now, they were able to find a handful of personal belongings near these remains, but I wasn't able to find a list of what they actually discovered. Officials just said that the gear wasn't actually enough to help them identify the body. However, the remains did miraculously contain a jawbone. And I say miraculously because a jawbone meant that they could use one very important tool in an attempt to identify their mystery victim, and that, of course, would be dental records. When the authorities finally released their findings months later in August of 2007, they acknowledged that Glenn Allen Mackey's name was absolutely on their radar. Naturally, they, as well as everyone else, wondered if the dental records might finally give them some kind of answers as to what happened to the poor young man that disappeared from the Rim Village parking lot more than a decade earlier. Dave Brennan was quoted saying, "We're certainly looking at that possibility. The challenge in 1991 was we did not know where he went to." Brennan also described Bybee Creek as a very remote, heavily wooded area that was, quote, "not the kind of spot where people would tend to go." So this breakthrough discovery seemed like the moment where we might finally get some real answers in this case. All this buildup and all the years of searching were leading to this moment. We'd finally get to the bottom of what happened to Glenn Allen Mackey, right? Sadly, that was not the case. At least not based on all of the public information that I was able to track down anyways. As of August 2007, authorities have declined to release any more details about the mysterious remains or about Glenn's case, quote, "pending further investigation." It's been almost 20 years since that time, and I'm starting to think that maybe number one, they weren't able to determine the victim using dental records at all, or number two, the victim wasn't Glenn Mackey, or number three, it was Glenn and his family wished that the information was not made public. Now, whether it's one of those options or some other reason, I've become convinced that we might not ever get another real statement on this case at all. Glenn's case might just be one of the rarest unsolved mysteries in national park history, which is, of course, a tragedy. And that also makes it really weird, but this next case reached a whole new level of weirdness because investigators discovered a scene that they said looked like someone had literally melted into the ground. I'm not making that up. In January of 1975, a 19-year-old man named Charles McCuller was on a cross-country road trip to photograph America's national parks. And by the way, if the name Charles McCuller sounds familiar to you, I made a video about his story many months ago. And so I'm gonna tell a briefer version of it here, but it's just so significant that if I can't talk about Crater Lake mysteries without talking about Charles's story. After traveling through states like Texas and Arizona, Charles arrived in Eugene, Oregon, where he stayed with a friend for a few days. His next stop was going to be Crater Lake, where he planned to capture the stark beauty of winter in the park, but he severely underestimated how hard it would be to navigate nearly 90 inches of snowy hell, which seems to be a theme in this video, by the way, the snow. Anyways, before leaving Eugene, Charles told his friend something that, looking back, seems pretty chilling. Charles told his friend that if he wasn't back by February 1st, they should call the police. And overall, that mysterious comment tells me that Charles, he knew this trip could be dangerous. But with that said, I don't think he was being reckless either. He stayed in regular contact with his parents. He packed warm clothing, food, camping gear, even a little plastic sheet for shelter. On January 29th, Charles left his Volkswagen van in Eugene and continued his journey by bus, by hitchhiking, and by walking. And so the next morning, Charles hitched a ride with a logging truck driver heading east, but was dropped off near Stump Lake, which was still like 30 miles away from the park. The driver watched as Charles walked along the snowy highway, and folks, that was the last time that anyone saw him. 3 more days passed, and Charles's friend in Eugene started to worry. Charles obviously still hadn't returned, and he also hadn't called or sent any mail. His ominous final warning was slowly becoming a reality. And as a result, his friend knew exactly what to do. On February 2nd, 1975, Charles McCuller was reported missing. But then, nearly 18 months later, on October 18th, 1976, 2 hikers made a discovery in a remote area that you might be familiar with, you might have heard of, called Bybee Creek. These hikers found a weathered backpack, and when they looked inside of it, they found a set of car keys with a Volkswagen logo. And so, could they have finally found a clue that could lead authorities to Charles? When rangers finally arrived in the area to search further, they found something truly disturbing. They reported that they had apparently discovered a pair of jeans on the ground, but that the jeans were unbuttoned and the belt was undone. And the strangest detail was that the jeans were also apparently standing in an upright vertical position. What the hell is that? And it actually gets even wilder because they looked into the jeans, and when they did, they discovered a human shin bone and a pair of socks that still contained human foot bones. Other remains were scattered in the surrounding area as well, a jawbone, part of a skull, and some other bone fragments spread all across the forest floor. Now, unlike the previous story, dental records were actually very useful here, and they would soon confirm what everyone feared. The remains belonged to Charles McCuller. Officials concluded that Charles died from exposure. The strange condition of the jeans could also be explained by something called paradoxical undressing, where hypothermia causes a person to feel overheated and then start to frantically remove their clothing. And that could explain why his jeans were unbuttoned, but not why they were found standing upright. Maybe they had frozen that way, or maybe the denim had stiffened over time. No one has ever determined the truth about this for sure. In the end, the official explanation points to a tragic miscalculation in extreme winter conditions, which does happen in these national parks. However, the strange details, Charles's ominous warning, the location of his remains, his missing camera, I didn't even mention that. Well, all of those things, the jeans, still leave lingering questions. There's no doubt that whatever happened to Charles McCuller is one of the strangest scenes ever discovered in a national park. Now, when you hear a story about a bizarre pair of jeans standing perfectly upright, you might feel like Crater Lake is pretty much cursed. And if it is, then you can probably trace that curse all the way back to July of 1952, when Crater Lake was home to one of the darkest mysteries in United States history. In July of 1952, 2 businessmen decided to explore Crater Lake National Park near the town of Klamath Falls, Oregon. 56-year-old Albert Marston Jones from Concord, California, and 52-year-old Charles Patrick Cohane from Detroit, Michigan were both executives at, you guessed it, General Motors. They had come to Crater Lake with their wives to enjoy a beautiful fishing trip. Charles had just gotten a promotion that put him in charge of the Western Regional operations, and he was accompanying Albert, who was a regional sales manager, on multiple calls in the area. The 2 men decided to spend the weekend exploring Crater Lake since their next sales call wasn't until Monday, and they planned to meet with some friends of theirs named John Vague and Frank Eberlein for an afternoon of fishing on Union Creek. They'd also be joined by Alan's 13-year-old son, Alan Eberlein. Charles and Albert checked out of their Klamath Falls hotel right around 11:30 a.m. on July 19th and decided to stop for lunch on their way to the fishing spot. John, Frank, and Alan arrived at the Annie Creek Canyon overlook around 2:45 p.m., but when they got there, Charles and Albert were nowhere to be seen. And so the group drove around the parking lot area until they came across the green 1951 Pontiac they knew the executives had been driving. John and Frank hopped out of the car to get a closer look, and they were shocked to discover that the keys to the Pontiac were still in the ignition. Like, what is that? Alan got out of the car too, and as they were all investigating for themselves, they even checked under the hood of the car. And look, I'm not really a big car guy, but I guess you can learn a lot about a car by checking the radiator. At least that's what these guys thought. And so out of pure curiosity, young Alan reached through the grill of the Pontiac and touched the radiator. When he did that, he felt a sudden burning sensation and quickly pulled his hand away. The heat, well, it told him one very important thing, which was that the car hadn't been there for very long. John, Frank, and Alan took in all of this information, the car keys, the hot radiator, and they started to assume that Charles and Albert might just be nearby exploring the area. And so they decided to wait there by the car for a little while, hoping that their friends would simply step out of the woods. It seems reasonable. So they waited, and waited, and waited. About an hour later, the radiator had long since gone cold, and the men started to come to terms with the fact that their friends weren't just gonna miraculously emerge from beyond the trees. And so they decided it was time to report Charles and Albert missing. When park rangers arrived at the scene, they initially thought that the two men had either gotten lost in the forest or maybe had somehow even fallen into Annie Creek Canyon. Two of the rangers even decided to climb down into the canyon to start their search. 12 trail crew members were sent down the nearby trails in hopes that they might find that Charles and Albert hadn't actually gotten very far at all. They searched until the sun went down, and they were even able to send food and supplies down into the canyon so that the crews could spend the night there and then continue throughout the next day. It was very clear that they thought this might be a quick and easy search effort, but everyone was about to learn that there would be nothing quick or easy about the nightmare that had just begun. 2 days later, the Oregon State Police and the FBI had joined the investigation. Search parties explored the forested areas all around the Annie Creek overlook, including one crew that went bushwhacking about a quarter-mile south of nearby Highway 62. 17-year-old Rex Ash was part of that crew, and as he pushed through the dense trees and the brush, he noticed something strange in the middle of a small clearing just ahead of him. It had caught his attention just enough to investigate further, and as he got closer to the clearing, he noticed another mysterious shape on the ground just 5 feet away from the first thing that he had spotted. With each step forward, the horrifying scene started to come clearer and clearer into view. Rex thought to himself, quote, "Oh lordy, there they are." Turns out, they had finally found Charles and Albert, but based on the state they were in, I bet they almost wished that they hadn't, because, well, neither one of them were alive. Rex yelled out to the rest of the crew, and almost immediately he was joined by 24 other searchers. Everyone was now looking upon a truly grisly crime scene. The men's bodies were found 5 feet apart from each other, not very far from Highway 62. And, well, it shocked everyone when they realized that both of the men had been tied up, both were missing their shoes, and both were found to have been shot execution style. Albert was found seated against a tree with a wound in the back of his head. Investigators were able to look at the powder burns that both men had suffered that indicated that whoever hurt them had done so from extremely close range. Albert and Charles both had their hands bound, and they had been gagged using pieces of torn clothing. Now, I mentioned that both men were missing their shoes, but it's worth pointing out that both of their socks were totally clean, suggesting that they had walked to this area in their shoes before ultimately taking their shoes off or having their shoes taken off for them. Albert's shoes were actually found nearby the crime scene, but Charles's shoes were suspiciously nowhere to be found. And another extremely puzzling part of this already extremely gruesome scene was the fact that both men had actually seemed to remove their dentures and then place them in their shirt pockets. The men had clearly been victims of some kind of attack, but was there any particular reason that either of them or maybe their attacker were so focused on shoes and dentures while in this moment? And that's just one of so many questions that this terrifying case had everyone asking. Investigators were able to recover two .32 caliber shell casings, but for some unknown reason, they were unable to match those casings to any weapon. And additionally, the two men had been carrying about $300 each in cash, which was, basically a small fortune back in 1952, and all of that money was now gone, along with the men's watches. However, their wallets were still with their bodies. And plus, the items in their car, which included some rather nice luggage and a camera, well, all that stuff was completely untouched. When the full autopsies came back, they revealed that both men had suffered severe trauma, including being kicked repeatedly. It was clear that something unbelievably awful had gone down in the woods of Crater Lake. Maybe this was a completely random crime, or maybe it was calculated. No one knew for sure, but it was time to get to the bottom of it. The discovery of Albert and Charles sparked one of the most extensive investigations in the history of the National Park Service, and since the park itself falls under federal jurisdiction, the FBI was all over it. Agents interviewed more than 200 park employees, tried to explain the insane details of the crime scene, and they chased after every single lead that they possibly could. The first big lead comes directly from Albert and Charles's fishing buddies, the people who first realized that they were missing. By the time that John and Frank decided to go report their friends missing, they left 13-year-old Alan to wait in the abandoned 1951 Pontiac all by himself. And while waiting for them to come back, Alan told authorities that a mysterious black car pulled up beside him. I didn't think much of it at the time, Alan would later say. He then went on to say that the operators of this black car were so startled when they realized a young boy was sitting in the back of it that they peeled out of the gravel parking lot and then sped off in a hurry. Now, years later, Alan would go on to tell reporters that he'd always wondered if that black car might have been driven by the men who hurt Albert and Charles. Unfortunately, young Alan wasn't able to piece together many other details about this encounter, and that threatening black car was never seen again. Another potential lead came from a park employee named Lincoln Lintz. Lincoln was driving a truck to the Crater Lake Lodge on the same day that Albert and Charles had gone missing, and while he was driving, he said that he saw two men in work clothes that seemed like they were taking two white-collar types into the woods. The same exact woods where the bodies were later found. Now, at first, he didn't really think too much of this, but as Lincoln continued driving towards the lodge, he apparently heard two loud bangs from the back of the forest, and they sounded like firecrackers, basically. And as if this wasn't already wild enough of an account, Lincoln says that he was later followed and harassed by two scruffy-looking men. He even claims that one of the men looked clearly older and was wearing a distinct beaded belt that spelled out the name Ralph. Lincoln told the authorities all of these very specific details, but apparently at the time they just completely dismissed him. And after the lodge closed in the fall, Lincoln went back to college and claimed that he tried to contact agents several more times, but they never returned his calls. He wondered if they thought that he was just crazy, but he knew deep down that his information could be the key to solving one of the most disturbing and puzzling murders in national park history. Now, when I personally think about Lincoln's witness statement, I can genuinely understand some of the reasons that the authorities might not have taken it too seriously. I mean, he claimed that he drove past the four men walking into the woods and then heard two loud bangs not long after that. But I mean, how could all of that have happened so close together when the bodies were found, not super far, but at least a quarter mile away from the road? It just seems like his account might have been a little bit inaccurate, misremembered, or extremely unlikely. Several theories have been proposed over the years, like for instance, maybe it was a botched robbery of the two rich-looking businessmen. Or maybe it was a targeted execution that somehow tied back to labor disputes within the car industry. Or maybe there was even some kind of involvement by a criminal gang. Believe it or not, despite all of these interviews, theories, and leads in the case of Albert and Charles, well, it's still completely unsolved. 70 years later, none of these questions have been officially answered, but that hasn't stopped a man named Monty Orrick, who claims to have solved the most unsolvable murder case in national park history. Monty is a photojournalist from Portland, Oregon, and in 2023, he published a book called The Crater Lake Murders. In that book, Monty explains that the murder case had indeed already been solved and that the FBI and the friends of the murderers have suppressed the truth for years for different reasons and at different times. That's what he said. Monty has gone on to say that in 1966, a man named Oscar Errol from Silverton, Oregon, made a deathbed confession to his wife, revealing the murderers' real identities. Oscar reportedly named two men, one named Kenneth Moore and one named John Wesley Cole. Apparently, Kenneth Moore actually just straight up admitted his guilt to Oscar years earlier, but Oscar never told a soul until right before he passed away. Monty fully believes Oscar's deathbed confession, and he argues that the FBI's case files also back up this story. And Monty also thinks that since Kenneth and John had already been dead for 4 years by the time they got the confession, the FBI realized they would never actually be able to bring anyone to justice, and they just swept everything under the rug. He ultimately said, quote, "It would have been professionally embarrassing to them." For decades, this case has loomed over Crater Lake like a black cloud. There's still so many bizarre unanswered questions like who is driving that mysterious black car that Alan saw, or why did both men have their dentures in their pockets when they were killed? Oh, and why did the FBI seem to dismiss multiple actionable leads? But beneath the media frenzy and all the investigative mistakes and the speculation, we have one of the most violent and bloody crimes imaginable happening right in the middle of a massive national park, and 70 years later, police still don't know who the hell was responsible for it, at least not officially. If you're a new viewer, I hope I earned your subscription, and if you liked this video, YouTube seems to think that you'll like this one as well, and so give it a click, and thank you for watching, and if you're ever in Crater Lake National Park, please be safe out there.